Okay, so we're continuing our football club history series, and we're looking at the history of Everton Football Club. It's a really interesting history with this club. Very successful team, and they were the second best team in the country in the 80s. There was just their nearest and dearest, Liverpool, across Stanley Park, who won a few more titles than them. However, they did push Liverpool very, very hard. In the mid-80s was their purple patch, and the 90s, that's when they win their last trophies. They've not had any silverware since 1995. There's a lot of reasons for that. They've had some poor Premier League seasons since 1995, and last season I think possibly was their worst Premier League season in the history of the club. Maybe the 98 season as well, but last season finishing 16th, surviving with only a handful of games left, avoiding relegation. Was a poor season last year, finishing 16th, but they've only spent 4 seasons outside of the top flight since the multi-division system has been introduced. They spent a record number of seasons in the top flight, and they've got the second longest stint in the current top flight concurrently. So they're not a bad side historically. In recent years, the success has dried up, the silverware has dried up, but they've been very consistent over the decades. The 50s is their low point. The 40s and 50s is their low point. They spent 3 consecutive seasons in the second division in the 50s. But they've been pretty good. And if it wasn't for 2 world wars, they could have won a hell of a lot more silverware. I honestly believe that. Much like Portsmouth, I think this side could have been quite dominant as well. So let's have a look at their history. So they're founded way back in 1878 as St. Domingo's Football Club. They only keep that name for a year before in 1879 they take on the Everton name that we know today. And their initial stadium was actually Anfield until 1892, and they left it over a dispute over the rent of the ground. And they moved to Goodison Park across Stanley Park in 1892. Anfield obviously gets in the hands of Liverpool, and Goodison Park becomes home of Everton. It currently has a capacity of 39,572. It will be their home until at least 2025. It all depends on when the new stadium is completed. Ground has been broken and construction has started on the new stadium. They were a founder member of the Football League in 1888, and they lift the third ever league title. Obviously, Preston North End win the first 2, and Everton win the third. So let's have a look at their honours, and let's go straight into their honours, and then we'll get into some of the fun facts and the high and low points. So their league honours start in the 3rd ever season of the Football League. They win it in the 1890-91 season, and this is where it gets interesting. In both World Wars, they win the last Football League title before players suspended. So in the 1914-15 season, so war has already been declared, they win the last league title before play is suspended, which is very interesting. Then they win it again in the 1927-28 season before they have a little down spell with their first relegation to Division 2, which is the 1930-31 season, which they win the Division 2 title that year. Then they win the Division 1 title the following season, 31-32. So literally they had a bit of a poor spell in the 29-30 season. They drop down a division. They come up the division and win the division title again. They also obviously then win the 1938-39 title, and of course war breaks out and play is ultimately suspended. Then the 40s and 50s is their lowest point. Obviously, if war doesn't break out in 1938-39, who knows what could have happened. They could have had more titles in this period, but play is suspended, much like the Portsmouth video that we did. Play is obviously suspended. So as I said, the 40s and 50s, when play resumes, is their weak period, basically. This is their darkest hour. This is their lowest point. Being in the second division for 3 consecutive seasons is the bad times. They've only spent 1 season prior, but so they sink to a low point between 1951-52 season to the 1953-54 season. Those 3 consecutive seasons in Division 2, they come back up in the 54-55 season. And then by the 1962-63 season, they're league champions again. So their low point really is the 50s. The late 40s to mid-50s is the low point, and they're back up top of the table in the 60s. They would then win the league title again in the 69-70 season, and then the 80s actually is their best decade, alongside the 30s, but for Silverware one, the 80s is actually their best decade. They win the league title in the 84-85 season, and the 86-87 season, That's not bad going. So that's their last ever league title was in 1987. So 2 years before I'm born, they win the league title, their ninth and final time. FA Cup they've won 5 times, and they spread out their FA Cup wins quite regularly over the 5 FA Cups. They do spread them out quite evenly. 1905, 1906. It's their second actual major trophy is the FA Cup, their first FA Cup. The 1932-33, so the year after they win their 4th league title, they win their second FA Cup. The 65-66 season, after their, they win the year England win the World Cup, the FA Cup. That's their 3rd FA Cup. The 83-84 season, the year before they win their first of their 2 titles in the 80s in the Football League, they win their 4th FA Cup. And the 94-95 season, which is their last major trophy, excluding Charity Shields. They haven't won any silverware since 1995, and the FA Cup and the Charity Shield in 95 are the last trophies they win. They win the Charity Shield 9 times, and the 80s they win it a lot. They first win the Charity Shield in 1928. Obviously, they were league champions the season before. 1932, again, league champions the season before. 1963, again, league champions the season before. 1970, they win the Charity Shield. They were league champions the season prior. 84, they were the Cup winners season prior. 85, they were the league winners the season prior. 86, I think they were league runners-up in 86. 87, league winners the season prior. And 95, the FA Cup winners the season prior. So the 80s, had it not been for Liverpool, they would have won the league at least 3 or 4 more times if it wasn't for Liverpool in the 80s. So those Division 1 titles could have been in double figures if it wasn't for Liverpool, and I do honestly stress that. I mean, Nottingham Forest gave Liverpool a good run as well, so did Aston Villa, and so did Everton. There were several clubs fighting against the very dominant Liverpool side, and occasionally they did win league titles. The 80s was their best decade, but as I say, haven't won a trophy since 95. Their only European title to date is the old Cup Winners Cup in the 84-85 season. So the 80s really was their best decade, and the mid-80s they were a very, very good side, competing against the likes of Liverpool, and Liverpool obviously were just slightly more dominant. But those league titles chases very, very close. There's not a lot of difference between the two sides. Everton were a very, very good side in the 80s and the decade before I was born. By the 90s, both Liverpool and Everton are declining, and they were going. And in Everton's case, they've never got out of that decline. They've been a top-flight side since throughout this entire period, haven't won anything. Liverpool have still managed to win trophies consistently since their last Division 1 title to their Premier League title and beyond. Everton haven't, and there's been a lot of poor decisions made in the boardroom. They've been trying to build a new stadium for 25 years. They've been talking about moving out of Goodison. There's been issues with support transfers. Their youth development isn't as good as it used to be. And there's a lot of debt at the club, and the ownership's under a lot of pressure. Frank Lampard, is he the right guy to be manager? I don't think so. A lot of people don't think so. It's not Lampard's fault where the club is where it is. This is on Bill Kenwright and Morshy and the direction the club has taken over many, many years. This is not something that's happened overnight. They haven't got back to that consistent competitive success that they've had historically, but they've still got the second longest stint concurrently in the top flight, and they have the record of the most seasons in the top flight at 118. They've only spent 4 seasons in the second tier. The 50s, they spent 3 consecutive seasons and 1 season in the 30s. They also have the third in points total in the top flight as well. The third most points acquired behind Manchester United and Liverpool in the top flight. They are a very, very good side historically. Just in more recent times, that success has dried up. And of course, their biggest rivals are Liverpool, the Merseyside derby, and of course there is that link with them being the previous owners of Anfield, tenants of Anfield, before Liverpool get the stadium. And there we go. Everton do face a real tough start to this season. They've not started the season well. They did finish just above the bottom 3 last year. So Everton is a club that, their long stint in the top flight is at risk unless they turn things around. But very historical club. They were a very, very good side in the decade before I was born, and they've only won one major trophy and a charity shield in my lifetime, which is a shame considering the history and the success this club has had. As a founder of the Football League, and consistent success dotted through almost every decade apart from the 40s and 50s. They've won silverware until the 90s, and then it stops. So from the 1900s to 1995, pretty consistent apart from the 40s and 50s is their low point, but they win trophies consistently up until the 90s, mid-90s, it stops. Hopefully Everton win some silverware soon. They've come close. They've been to an FA Cup final since 1995 under David Moyes. They've never won a League Cup, which I find surprising as well. So there we go. But there's a brief history of Everton. Thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts in the comment section below, and I'll have some more videos for you very, very soon.